Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. Now, before we get into today's massive topic, here's a reminder. If you like this show and you want to see it succeed, then please consider dropping a review on Podchaser or your preferred platform of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you're listening to this show. Please consider leaving a review, a comment. All these things help a lot to grow this show. In addition, you can check out the Discord community. Link will be in the description, and Patreon. Support the show, support me in trying to bring you this content. All the rest of the links are in the description below. Thank you so much to everybody that supports the show and listens to the show. I hope you enjoy it. Today, we've got something very special for you. I am joined by the wonderful Josh Leonard of the Pursuit of Infinity podcast. Hello, Josh.
Hey, Christian. Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
It's always an honor to have you back on the show. For those who may not be familiar, Josh Leonard hosts a wonderful show called the Pursuit of Infinity podcast. It's an excellent kind of deep dive. It's very similar to my show, but in a very different way. I don't know, like similar maybe cadence or approach. Josh is also a stickler for facts and just going really into detail with his research. So if you like this show, you'll definitely like that show. And we've also done a lot of shows together. Josh was on episode 200, which we did all about life after death and also near-death experiences. And with this show, the story behind this was that I was reaching out trying to get people on board to do a show about the paranormal because I figured spooky season, that makes sense. Speaking of which, I did an episode for my Patreon show, Life with Christian Reeve, all about paranormal experiences. So make sure you check that out, patreon.com/Christian Reeve. Now I'm going to stop plugging and I'll start talking about the topic at hand, which is UFOs, because Josh reached out to me and said, well, I don't know about the whole paranormal thing, but I'd definitely be up for talking about UFOs. And I'm like, ooh, that's interesting. And I know that my audience are very into the idea of these kind of topics, these strange and mysterious topics. I know that I am. I've always been a bit of a stickler, a fascinated type of person when it comes to the paranormal and conspiracies, and UFOs and everything about it just kind of ticks all those boxes, really. And also another element to this that I find quite interesting, and I only really realized once I delved into it, is that, look, we both come from different nations, and arguably UFOs and the whole UFO phenomenon originated really in the United States. But we actually have a lot of interesting stuff that's happened in the UK and internationally, and we'll get into some of that today. But before we get into that, what is a UFO? What is it? An unidentified flying object, UFO, also known as a flying saucer, refers to any aerial object or optical phenomenon not readily identifiable to the observer. UFOs became a major subject of interest following the development of rocketry after World War II, and were thought by some researchers to be intelligent extraterrestrial life visiting Earth. My first question to you, Josh, have you ever seen a UFO?
Maybe. I have a weird sighting that is not quite definitive for me, but it was something that I did see that I cannot explain with normal human reasoning.
Tell us more.
So, real quick, I was at my fiance's sister's house. We were all just chilling, hanging out, and it was probably about 11:30 at night. So we walk outside, a few people are smoking cigarettes, and we're just kind of chilling. And we look up, and it's a really nice view of the sky. You can really see a lot there. There's not a lot of light pollution, so you can really see a lot of stars. So we're looking up, and what we see, there were four of us outside in the backyard at this particular moment. So we look up, and we see what looks like a shooting star. Have you ever seen a shooting star when like they have like that nice tail on the end of it? But this one was really bright. And instead of being more elongated, it was short and it was fat. and it was very bright and it was very quick. So it sort of flashed in and then stopped. And when it stopped, there was just this bright light. And what it did was it broke off into 4 separate like lights. That's the best I can describe it. 3 of them seemed to lock into a triangular formation, and then one of them just went straight back. So I followed the one that went straight back because that's the one that started moving first. So behind me was their house. So I'm looking up and up and up because it's going back farther and farther. And then eventually it gets to the point where I can't see it anymore because the house is in the way. And it's just gone. And then I look back at the other ones and I see, so I wasn't following the other 3, but my fiance and one of her really good friends and her good friend's husband were looking at the other 3. So they were moving together like this, like spinning. And they were like, so to me, what I saw was I just saw 2 of them. I wasn't seeing the third one because I hadn't really paid attention to exactly where they were going. So I saw the 2 of them, and they were moving in unison the same way. And what my fiance said was that while I was looking at the one going straight back, they saw the 3 fly. And whenever the space in between each of the lights would go over a star, the star would disappear. So it looked like they were viewing a solid triangular object with 3 lights on either point moving. And even seeing the 2 that I saw, it was so weird because stars, they don't move like that. Because it's not as if it was a shooting star or some kind of an object that was moving like in one direction. These things were spinning and moving together, and they were changing direction. Very, very strange. So I like to say that we witnessed a celestial event that night. I have no idea what it was, but to me, it was an unidentified anomalous phenomenon.
This is fascinating to me for various reasons, but the biggest one, and sorry to introduce this at the beginning of this show, but I will be doing another show with Josh all about UFO sightings. Now, you may be asking, why are you going to do that in a different show? Why not do it in this show? Well, for 2 reasons. One, when you listen to this whole show and you see just how much stuff that we're going to go into, and bear in mind, it's not even the tip of the iceberg. There is so much stuff to dive into. Like, I probably did like 0.5% research, and I did a ton of research for this show, for both shows even. And I still, I found out terms that I didn't even know existed, like ufologist, for example, is a term that exists. A person who dedicates their life, as the name suggests, to studying UFOs. Now, I quickly want to say, though, on the UFO sighting thing there, everything you just said is very consistent with a bunch of accounts that I've read into. Now, I'm not going to give away any more than that because I've got something very special planned for that particular show, but I will leave it at that because I think it's very interesting. Everything that you said, there's a lot of things in there, like key things that you look out for, consistent patterns amongst all these different sightings. And I think the biggest thing about UFOs that's really interesting is that anyone that's ever seen a UFO, when they talk about it, they instantly get, typically, maybe not so much now, and we'll get into that, but back in the day, you were always kind of accused of making it up, or, oh no, it's definitely like an aircraft, or you're just talking crazy talk, you're making up stories. But when you get like, I don't know, 80,000 of these sightings throughout the years in various parts of the world, and they all have these consistencies and patterns amongst all of the different sightings, it makes you start wondering if maybe there's some element of truth to this. I don't know. It depends. I asked you about your UFO experience. I've never seen a UFO in the traditional sense, but then let's look at the definition for a second. UFO, unidentified flying object. Most of us assume, oh, well, alien spacecraft, right? But really, it just refers to any kind of, as the name suggests, flying object in the sky that we can't identify. The only thing I've really seen close to that, with the exception of, shooting stars and stuff like that, is like certain lights in the sky. And normally I'd look at them and be like, wow, that's got to be a plane. But you can normally kind of, planes have like a very specific, I don't know how to put it, like speed, I suppose. If you can make them out in the sky and they're flying over, what they're probably doing is one or two things. Either they're flying to the nearby airport, which you would hear, to be honest. But if it's far enough out that you can't hear it, then chances are they're just flying over your country, but you can make it out. They're flying low enough that you can make it out. And they've kind of got that like quite slow gliding kind of, it's quite consistent. Like, you can tell that it's a plane. A few times I looked in the sky and I assumed, maybe that's the International Space Station, which is like a really, really bright light. If you can make it out in the sky, but the thing is, it's beaming. It's almost like the moon on a bright night. It's like, and it stays fixed. You wouldn't really, to the best of my knowledge, be able to tell that it's moving because it's moving so slowly, or we're spinning so slowly. I don't know. But I have occasionally seen lights pass through a little bit less brighter than the International Space Station, but it'll either be bright white or a few different lights, and it'll be moving through the sky quite quickly. Not super quickly, but quite quickly, and it's definitely not a plane. It couldn't really be a helicopter because that's too high. There's a certain altitude they can't go past. So it's got to be, I don't know, either a government aircraft or something else. I don't know. But that's the kind of the best experiences I could give what I've seen. I'm sure many of us have seen stuff in the sky we couldn't explain, but it's interesting to me the definition of what a UFO is. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but the actual term UFO is now changing. The official term has changed, but we'll get into that. Another question I quickly want to ask you about is earliest memories of UFOs. Can you sort of recall the earliest time you recall hearing about a UFO?
Probably on, do you remember that show Unsolved Mysteries back in like the 90s?
I probably remember. I don't think I ever sat down and watched it, but if I'd see a clip, I probably know. I definitely recognize the voiceover.
Yeah, it was generally a show where they would look into like crimes and things like that, anomalous situations where they were unsolved. But some of the episodes had UFOs on them. And I remember seeing those when I was a kid, and I was thinking, man, this is super interesting stuff. Because those episodes were always so compelling. And of course, they ended in mystery. Nobody knew what it was. Most of the time, they would get the police involved. So you'd have at least that level of accountability to where you'd have an entire police department that was saying, yeah, we saw this, or we got calls for this. And a lot of the same types of reports coming from different parts of the state or county. So yeah, very interesting stuff there on that show. And I mean, obviously when you see something on TV as opposed to like just somebody talking about it, it seems a bit more credible.
Absolutely. The earliest memory I have is I was in primary school. So I don't know what that is equivalent in America. I never know the actual middle school. No, maybe a bit younger.
Probably like elementary school.
Elementary, yes.
School. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because that's right. You've got it split, haven't you? You've got elementary, middle school, high school. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Okay. Oh, wow. That doesn't actually seem that complicated. Oh, okay. No, never mind. Well, I was in elementary school, I think. And I recall the teacher putting on, and this is how old this is, either a tape cassette or a CD of a record. The way she explained it was, oh, you need to listen to this really scary story about aliens. And we're like, oh, and we listen to this story. And it's like an old timey 1940s, 1950s radio play style thing. When it's like, oh my God, they're coming from Mars. What are these creatures? Like that kind of thing, right? And she purposefully didn't tell us exactly what it was. Like she explained it as aliens, but she didn't explain like the details and the history behind it until afterwards. So we listened to this recording. It's about 15, 20 minutes. And then she debunks it for us. She says, right, so this was a hoax, a very famous hoax. Now, I wanted to look into this before, but I couldn't find the name of it. But I'm sure people that listen, especially in stateside, will know what I'm talking about. It's like this kind of fake recording, fake hoax style recording where they made people believe it was real, and they actually played it on the radio, I believe, but it wasn't real. But it kind of what's the word? When you sort of bank off something, I can't remember the term I'm looking for. They kind of like took the fact that, you know, the country was obsessed with UFOs at that time, and, you know, banked on that, and you know, insert your fake recording here, capitalized. That's the word I'm looking for. They capitalized on that, and a lot of people believed it was real and got really, really concerned and scared and worried. And then of course it was exposed to be a fake, but it got people's attention, which is the really interesting thing. And we'll go into this a little bit more as we go out throughout this episode, making a lot of promises here. We will deliver. A lot of the early newspaper clippings that I read, it was kind of like a battle in society in the States between people that were like, no, this is clearly just unidentified government business. This is, you know, stop talking nonsense. And then there's other people that are like, well, I don't know, there's something to this. This falls out of logic and reasoning, and, you know, you've told us one thing, and then we found this evidence that suggests something else. And I think that was also the beginning of people starting to realize that, you know, maybe the government doesn't always tell the truth. You know, like the official government account and then what the facts are, maybe two different things. Because back then, people would just like pretty much trust the government completely. Like only a small subsection of society would actually question things. And if they would, they get ostracized or laughed at or, you know, targeted in some shape or form. There was always people challenging the system, but, you know, I think the UFO saga and everything that existed thereafter really helped to like push this narrative of, not to make things political, but, you know, questioning the government, questioning the information that you're given, official accounts, you know, this idea that whatever the official account is given, it might be falsified. It might in some way not actually reflect facts. And that's an interesting thing, especially with when it comes to UFOs, because we know people lie all the time, but sometimes there's no reason for people to lie about something. You know, sometimes it's like, well, what would be the gain in lying here, you know? So let's move on. I want to give a kind of rough, I suppose, timeline of events, try to kind of break this down for anyone. I'm pretty sure most people know about all of these things, but maybe they don't. And here's your opportunity to learn a little about the history of UFOs. Now, I got a lot of this information initially, timeline-wise, from history.com. So if any of it is incorrect, then you can blame them. It'll be a cold day in hell before I use Wikipedia as a source. So I wanted to find something that, do you know what I mean? Like seemed fairly factual. I mean, they use it. They refer to a lot of studies and journal articles and news articles and a lot of different things. And I think that's always just a good rule of thumb. You know, if you're looking to source things, just don't use Wikipedia, guys. So Roswell. Now, there were accounts that existed before of people potentially seeing UFOs, but the Roswell incident, to be specific, is really kind of what put this whole idea of UFOs on the map and put it maybe into the public consciousness, as it were. So I'm just going to kind of read verbatim and we can sort of break this down together and go through all of this. So the same year that Arnold saw the flying objects, rancher W.W. Mac Brazel, what a name, came across a mysterious 200-yard long wreckage near an Army airfield in Roswell, New Mexico. Local papers reported it was the remains of a flying saucer. The US military issued a statement saying that it was just a weather balloon, though the newspaper photograph suggested otherwise. Here's a direct quote. At first, the Army command at Roswell issued a press release announcing it had recovered a flying disc, as UFOs were called then. This press release was then retracted and further press coverage restricted. Interesting. At a press conference in Fort Worth, the Army explained that the intelligence officer and others at Roswell had misidentified the debris, which was, in fact, the remains of a downed balloon with a metallic radar reflector attached and not a UFO. The flames of conspiracy were further fanned in the 1950s when dummies with latex skin and aluminium bones that looked eerily like aliens fell from the sky across New Mexico and were hurriedly picked up by military vehicles. To those who believed in the earlier Roswell sightings, this seemed like a government cover-up. For the Air Force, these dummy drops were a way to test new ways for pilots to survive falls. 50 years later, the military issued a subsequent statement admitting that the Roswell wreckage was part of Project Mogul, the top secret atomic espionage project. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that the key thing I want to kind of focus on just now is the information that's given there and the timeline of it. So an initial statement is released. They then quickly change that and restrict information and restrict the media as well, which is interesting. And then they turn around with this story of it being a downed weather balloon. I suppose if you're going to question this, it comes down to a key question. You know, like those diagrams that ask you, if you think X, Y, and Z, then take this route. If you think this route, then think this. So I guess the key question right now is, if you believe that this was in fact aliens, then you would maybe take the route of thinking, okay, there's a reason why the government might lie and cover this up. If you don't believe that it's aliens, then it's pretty conclusive that, you know, they were just trying to kind of understand what it was, and they realized, if we say this initial statement, this incites panic, we need to retract this. So I guess my first question to you, Josh, would be, do you believe in aliens?
Oh, it's so hard. This is a particularly interesting case because, as you had mentioned, I think it's interesting to note how quickly the U.S. government responds to these types of events and how quickly they're there to clean it up and take it out and leave no evidence of anything being left behind. And a lot of the official government narrative is very suspect as well, because there were pictures that were taken. I forget who the guy was, but he worked at the Air Force Base, I believe, where it was down near. And there's pictures, you can find them online, and he's holding this like metallic tin-looking tinfoil object, some sort of material. And he's smiling, and this was like an official government released photo saying, this is what we found. This is just a weather balloon, non-ordinary type of metallic metal, nothing to see here. And later, that same guy who posed with that stuff had said that that wasn't what they had found. That was not part of the wreckage. And that was orchestrated by our government officials to perpetuate the cover-up. And they said that what they actually found was this strange metallic material that you could crumble it up, and then when you let go of it, it instantly would like shift right back into position as it was. They also said there were weird like hieroglyph type letters on it as well. Now, again, this is all sort of speculation because it is coming from people who were quote unquote there or claimed to be there. But this goes against the government narrative, of course. But it's interesting to see the way that our government responds. And then if you try to analyze the truth or the validity of what you're seeing, what they're presenting to you. And I mean, there's just so much of it that seems very suspect to me.
Yeah. And I've always kind of thought, I mean, okay, we'll get into this in a second, like what's happened in more recent history within like the last year, even, I believe. But for so long, it kind of seemed like the government was like just always saying, no, there's definitely no sign. This is all nonsense. There's no chance in hell. no chance in hell that there will ever be aliens. It's not factual. There are no aliens. They just kept saying that, kept saying that, kept saying that. And I don't know, the cynic in me is always like, well, that sounds like something that someone would say if they were trying to cover something up. But then I did also think like maybe they are telling the truth. I mean, it's not. They can't lie all the time about everything. Surely they must be telling the truth sometimes. But we can't really continue this conversation without talking about what's happening right now. They pretty much just came out and said, yeah, aliens are real. And a lot of people at the time, when was this? Was earlier this year or last year? I can't remember. But they came out and said this in a press conference. And obviously my first initial reaction was, what the fuck? But I was also like, and a lot of people were like making the joke about how, the government turns around and says this and we're all questioning, well, why would you say this? Is this distraction tactics so that we don't pay attention to something else? Which is something that the media does. It's very interesting, especially when you look at, again, I don't want to make this political, but it's kind of impossible to not talk about government and government strategies when you're talking about UFOs and like the way that they do things. So often when there's like a big legislation or something that the government is either not necessarily trying to cover up, but they don't want a lot of attention on, like a particular bill that's being passed that's going to be controversial, almost definitely there'll be like some sensational news story, whether it's a big celebrity thing or some big geographical thing or just some big massive story to take your attention away from it. And it really felt at the time, and a lot of people were saying this online at the time as well, that the whole announcing that aliens are real kind of thing was exactly that, like a distraction technique. Now, the first thing I thought, and again, Captain Cynic, you'll see this throughout the show. I looked at it like, I call bullshit. I believe aliens exist, but I don't believe anything the government tells me about aliens. I think that's all nonsense. I think them saying that was a distraction technique, but I also did kind of consider the fact that, okay, let's just say, for instance, that this was genuine and they were trying to ease us into this idea of telling us that aliens are real. How would you go about doing that in a way that wouldn't incite panic? Now, let's give some context here. Every single movie we've ever seen, and granted they are movies, but movies are often a reflection of life and how people really are. And the more I live in this world, the more I realize that. I always used to think like, well, that's not how people react. And then you look at something like the pandemic and how people, beat each other up in supermarkets to get toilet roll, and you realize that people are idiots and that they will panic about literally anything. Another good example, we had a massive fuel crisis here in the UK right around the time that the Ukraine-Russia war started, and it meant that people were queuing up frantically to fill up their petrol in their cars and also like pour extra stuff into like gas canisters or whatever. Basically hoarding stuff. And it was people's natural reaction. They were scared, they were worried, so they started hoarding. Yeah, during COVID, everyone was, hoarding loads and loads of, not just toilet paper, but, like sanitary products, anything that was like basic essentials, like just almost this kind of doomsday style approach to survival, right? Now, I'm not going to like have a massive go at people. I understand, like, you get scared, you don't think rationally. I understand that. Like, not everyone is level-headed all of the time. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm always 100% level-headed. We all have our moments where we stress the fuck out and maybe react in a sort of purely emotional way. However, when we bring it back to aliens and we think about the concept of, do aliens exist? If tomorrow, I don't know, an alien was revealed in a press conference and the alien started talking to us, everyone would lose their fucking mind. And I guarantee you it would be like civil war. People would be, there'd be loads of people just going nuts and be like, I'm going to destroy the aliens, screw the aliens, all that kind of stuff. It would be a cause for concern, for sure. a big part of me kind of looks at this and thinks, do you know what? Maybe their government in some way is trying to protect us on that front. Like maybe aliens do exist and they're finding a way to ease us into this. I don't know. A lot of questions I can ask you with this, Josh. I think let's just start with your initial kind of reaction to that news that aliens are real.
Yeah, man. One of the most interesting parts of the way that our government has been presenting this to us is that it's become quite obvious that our elected officials are not the people who are in charge of or understand these programs.
Mm-hmm.
There are two governments, they call it the shadow government, call it whatever you want. But these parts of government seem to be run by defense contractors, military people. So what you're seeing is earlier in the year, there was an organization that it's called AARO, AARO, and they are tasked with, it's a Pentagon-based task force that's basically tasked with analyzing any UAPs, what they call it now. That's the new word for UFO, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or I believe now they've even changed it again to UFO or to unidentified aerial phenomenon. They keep flopping back and forth between those two, I believe. So what they did is they had a little press conference and they showed a video that was taken in, I believe it was Iraq during the war. And it's interesting that these things tend to be seen more so in war zones. That's why the first sightings or the first ramping up of UFO sightings happened when we dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan. So this AARO is what they call it, AARO. They're tasked with, again, looking into the UFO phenomenon, and they released this interesting video of a ball. It's like just a sphere, a metal sphere that was just flying through. I believe it was drone footage of Iraq during the war. And they had said, this is something that we don't know what it is. We have no idea. And that was essentially the end of the press conference. That's all they did was essentially show this. But this video and photos of it had already been released. They had already been declassified, and you could find them online. Certain people who cover UFOs had already shown them. And then there was another press conference. There's this guy named David Grush. He is the most recent whistleblower. He was a high-level intelligence official who came forward and essentially said that he knows of people and talked to people who were involved in back engineering programs of downed craft. And he testified to Congress along with Ryan Graves, who is a military guy, and also Commander David Fravor, who's a military guy as well. Both have seen UFOs and have actually tried to engage with them in their aircraft, which is a super interesting story as well. Both of those guys, they have really, really interesting stories. But one of the main points that David Grush was trying to get across, and something that is so intriguing to me, is that the defense contractors of the world are the ones who are in possession of these craft, not our elected officials, not necessarily our government. The people that you and I know as government, presidents, senators, congressmen, those are not the people who know about what's happening here. There's an obvious divide. Because during the congressional hearing, I mean, all of our, some of our top congressmen and congresswomen were asking some really good questions, and they don't know about what's going on. They're trying to figure it out. So what's really intriguing to me is that we have this aspect of our government who funnels our tax dollars to defense contractors like Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and they are the ones who are in control of what happens to any of these craft that happen to be found.
And this is a fascinating point. Sorry to steer off UFOs for a second, but again, we're probably gonna touch on a lot of different things connected with this that are important just in general. This idea that private business has a hold over government, it blows my mind. I saw it in the banking industry a lot. You know, like we bailed out in the UK, we bailed out a bunch of banks after the 2008 financial crisis. And I remember thinking at the time, and again, look, I was just some idiotic teenager. What the hell do I know, right? But I looked at it and I was like, why is the government funding or bailing out a privately owned company? Now, don't get me wrong. I realize the fact that a lot of people like you and me were going to lose a lot of money, and that would really hurt the economy in some shape or form, right? But I looked at that and I was like, why isn't another private company buying them out or something? Why is that not being taken care of by the businesses themselves? Why is that the government and the taxpayers' problem? I looked at it like, you know, I understand that a government obviously by definition has to govern, but it's always very iffy when there's interference. Now, a lot of what I'm saying will come across as like naive. Like I do realize that the government is heavily invested in business in many shapes and forms, both legal and maybe not not so legal. And you know, I know there's things like, as you put it, funneling, or another way you can put it is lobbying, where we know that people who support government will give them money, particularly during a time. So like in the States, it'd be during the US presidential campaigns. That's how all of the candidates get their money. If you ever wondering like, how do they have all this money? A lot of it will be from their own pocket. You know, for instance, you know, Bush, that all that money came from oil for the most part, but there were a lot of financial backers as well, like be it companies, people of interest who had an interest in that specific person getting elected, because when that person gets elected, in return, it's like a reward. It's like, I give you this money, you make sure that this goes into law, or you make sure that this thing happens, and da, 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 da. And the exact same thing happens in the UK, just in a slightly different way. Now, bringing it back to UFOs, it's interesting that, as you said, like pretty much all the power and information comes from privately owned companies and not from the government itself. It's almost like the government just knows jack shit. They have to wait for the companies to tell them, and also tell them like how they need to relay this information. And look, it's hard to not sit and play conspiracy theories, because I like to kind of look at the facts at all times and not just purely delve into conspiracy. But at the same time, when you ask these people like a straight question and they can't give you that answer, and the official statements on any given incident just have so many holes in them, it's very difficult to take it seriously. So when you mentioned, for instance, the idea of like a shadow government, right? I've always been open to that possibility and concept. But when it specifically comes down to UFOs and the concept of whether or not UFOs exist, I feel like the governments that we see, they can't be the only player in. There's got to be many other people around the world, organizations, companies, many of which we're aware of. The Bilderberg Group is an example of that. Obviously, you've got a lot of the world's wealthiest families as an example. You know, like the way things are and the way they're told to us are two different things, you know, and that all... So, again, try not to get into conspiracy, but that's the reality. I mean, we see it every day. We get lied to in a very small manner in everyday life. And sometimes we look at that and we go, yeah, this shit happens. But other times, if we sit there and we go, no, hang on, that's outrageous. I want justice. How dare they lie to me? How dare they do this? How dare they do that? It's interesting, because when you start challenging these things, that's when sometimes dodgy things can start happening. Unexplained phenomenon can start happening. I think we're in a very interesting time right now, because if we take things like the Epstein thing, just as an example, I was amazed that guy actually got convicted and sent down, and so did his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, I believe her name was. That fascinated me, because those were two people that were very kind of invested in that higher world, in you know, like they had all high friends in high places, as the old saying goes. But they were all like very clearly had their finger in a lot of different pies, and they knew a lot of people, and they were operating at a level that we would never see or know about. Like, then they get arrested and charged for these crimes. And I looked at that and I was like, I don't know about you, but I looked at that and I thought, who did they piss off? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't look at their crimes. I was like, who, because they must have been protected or like, look, let's look at it in a very basic manner. Your friends are your friends until they become your enemies. And what happens when people become your enemies? Some people, they hold a grudge. They just don't want anything to do with you. Other enemies will throw you under a bus in order to save themselves, right? We see this very commonly in the workplace. And this is with like people that aren't your friends, people that barely know you. They're just trying to save their own back. And in order to do that, they will absolutely throw you out to dry. But when it's people that you've known and done business with, and maybe even are very close with, that's kind of like an unreal level of betrayal. And I look at instances like this, and I just kind of can't help but think there's more to it. I just can't sit and believe the information that's given to me officially, because going back to sorry to, sound like a broken record, but the official accounts never really cut it. And I look at like the wider there's a reason. There's always several reasons behind anything, and the media never sits and talks about those things. They're not going to sit there and say, well, we reckon that actually the reason this has happened is because they've might have annoyed some people and fallen out with some. They're not going to say that. They're going to talk about whatever fits the agenda at a given time, or whatever whoever's paying them is telling them to say. This is one of the reasons why I don't watch the news, because it's not the news. It's like you want the news and facts. You have to kind of like go out and find them yourself, really. Can't rely on media outlets anymore. I don't think you ever really could, to be honest, but I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there. How can we bring this back to UFOs?
Well, it definitely seems like they probably killed Epstein. I mean, I don't know. It just seems that
allegedly,
way.
who knows?
I mean,
that in there for legal reasons.
Yeah, right. Yeah, let's just say that. Allegedly, this is for informational and entertainment purposes only.
Go on.
But he was also involved a lot with scientists and contractors himself. So it's even possible that he was involved with some of this UFO UAP stuff. But yeah, it seems that somebody had to go down for what was going on with the whole Epstein thing, and he was starting to get sloppy. He was arrested a few times, and if you ask me, I think that there's people beyond Epstein that are doing the same things he was. I mean, it just seems that he was the kind of guy that would get dirt on you, and then that would allow him to control you. You know what I mean? He seemed to me like a government asset. Somebody who would, he had a painting of Bill Clinton in a dress in his, like the lobby of his apartment. Like, come on. That is a clear statement that he owns Bill Clinton. If you walked into one of your friend's houses and you saw a painting of yourself up on the wall in a dress, you would think to yourself, shit, this guy's got me. You know what I mean? It's a clear power move. And there's just so many things with Epstein that are really, really sus, in my opinion. But
I could tie this back to UFOs, I reckon. So, speaking specifically to the idea of being sloppy, I agree with everything you just said, by the way. But I think that maybe when it comes to the reporting of UFOs, and certainly people who speak out, or people who, whistleblowers certainly have to always be careful. I mean, just look at Snowden as an example. Now, granted, that wasn't to do with UFOs, that was to do with government stuff, but he now has to live pretty much in an existence where he's like off the grid, constantly avoiding the government. Don't forget that it's not like a dodgy wing of the government or something. He's avoiding the government, like the official government, for just coming out and saying what he saw. And granted, a lot of people will say, okay, well, maybe he lied about it, and that, if someone has lied about something, an organization that you're a part of would want to refute that, right? Especially if it was not non-factual. I get that. I understand that. But let's suppose for a minute that he was correct in the things that he was saying, um, should he not be protected for doing that? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like,
That's the thing. It's like the U.S. government has never actually refuted his claims. They just say, we got to get this guy because
yeah.
you know what I mean? So they're just after him. They've never said, and you know what? Same with Julian Assange. They threw that dude in jail and he's rotting in prison just for being an honest journalist. That him and Snowden, to me, they're heroes of our time that are just not appreciated to the degree that they should be right now.
I see this again and again and again in various countries in the world, and it really often makes me think about this idea that, like, if you do speak the truth or you try to, eventually the system's going to get you. It's going to punish you for doing so. Shit, I mean, look, we're just two random guys doing a podcast, but you look at it and you're like, what if this became a problem? You know what I mean? Like, every time, but I'm of the opinion, you know what, like, fuck it. Like, there's so much to worry about in the world and be scared of. Just fuck it. Just, you might as well just speak the truth. And if some people hear it, good. But I'm also kind of open to the idea that there's a lot of bullshit, like, just because conspiracy theorists want to, throw all these ideas out there, that doesn't make it fact either. Because I find with a lot of conspiracy theories, there are major holes in them a lot of the time. And it's always a shame as well when a conspiracy theory stops being about the quest for truth and facts and starts becoming about trying to support a given narrative or theory. It's a bit like if a scientist, has like a very specific hypothesis, and they're, the experiment is not going well and they're not getting what they want. And it's like, well, but this is a good thing because now you're disproving this, or you're learning something else. But they're so desperate in, finding evidence that this thing is true. And that's a deeper problem that exists in humanity, of this idea of like, if you can't defeat your own beliefs and purely just focus on the facts, then you're going to always be trapped in this idea of chasing that which is not true, that which is in fact non-factual, or, you'll never be able to grow. Like, you got to be in a position where you can accept that, hey, you're going to be wrong about things and things are going to be disproven, and something, maybe even like everything that you believe in right now might be a total lie. You have to be prepared for that, and understand that you might have to change everything potentially. But that's only going to happen if you're focusing purely on the facts and not just what people tell you or what you read about. And I really want to push that idea as well, because, like, although a lot of especially when it comes to UFOs, we're talking about secondhand accounts of things, Now, one thing, and I'll explore this more with you, Josh, in the UFO sightings episode that we're going to do as a follow-up to this episode, but I find it very interesting, like, the different sources that it came from. Because it's one thing when it's like just a random member of the public, but when it's coming from like police officers, air traffic controllers, former RAF pilots, it starts to kind of lend a bit more weight to it, I suppose, or a bit more, should we say, cachet, You start wondering, well, it's like one thing if Bob is out in the garden and he thinks he sees like something flying across the sky, versus former RAF pilot who's been, in the skies for like 30 years of his life, and sees a lot of different things, and would be able to distinguish between what's maybe a government aircraft or a weather balloon and what is something that you've never seen before in your entire life, that doesn't fit anything that you would be either trained to look out for or be aware is just a human craft. Not necessarily alien craft, but just something identifiable as like a human craft of some description. But yeah, so we brought it back to UFOs. There you go. See, I tried my best. Let's talk more about the timelines of and the history behind UFOs. So, Project Blue Book, sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena. See, already got UAPs back in the day. And in 1948, the US Air Force began an investigation of these reports called Project Sign. Cold War tension was mounting, and the initial opinion of those involved with the project was that the UFOs were most likely sophisticated Soviet aircraft, although some researchers suggested that they might be spacecraft from other worlds. The so-called extraterrestrial hypothesis, ETH, remember that, because we're going to be using that a lot throughout this conversation. Within a year, Project Sign was succeeded by Project Grudge. Who names these bloody projects, by the way? Just like Project Grudge, which in 1952 was itself replaced by the longest lived of the official inquiries into UFOs, Project Blue Book. Headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. From 1952 to 1969, Project Blue Book compiled reports of more than 12,000 sightings or events, each of which was ultimately classified as 1, identified with a known astronomical, atmospheric, or artificial, which they say is human-caused phenomenon, or 2, unidentified, the latter category. Approximately 6% of the total included cases for which there was insufficient information to make an identification with a known phenomenon. One thing I just wanted to touch on quickly here is that this was obviously, as the text mentions there, happening throughout the Cold War. And you just know that those two governments were using this to their advantage to sort of, you would just sway the public or distract the public or try and kind of convince them, you know, like, oh, it's the Russians doing, and or it's the Americans doing, or it's like it's this, that, and the other. And I don't know. It's interesting when politics get involved with things like this, because look, UFOs and extraterrestrial beings, that supersedes government and earthly things, right? If we discover tomorrow definitive 100%, 1,000 ironclad proof that aliens exist and are among us, it kind of means that our problems here on Earth are quite lesser than, really. I mean, I think they are anyway. But and I look, I'm like Miss Captain wishes it was Star Trek. So I look at, you know, Star Trek: The Next Generation, the movies. I knew this was going to come up at some point, but in the movie Star Trek First Contact, I believe is the movie, it tells a double story that basically an alien species trying to kill humans and the rest of the universe, blah, blah, blah. But they have basically, part of the story is they have to go back to the point where humans established first contact with aliens, specifically the Vulcans. Now, it's explored in the story that the aliens, the Vulcans, have been monitoring the humans for some time. And they've also sort of established this as law within the Star Trek series, that aliens always do this, but they hide, they don't interfere on purpose because of this thing called the Prime Directive. They don't want to kind of interfere with natural progress, which kind of makes sense logically. I think that's probably something that we would most likely establish if we were able to do that, you know? Anyway, the reason why the Vulcans choose to come and meet humans is because the humans create faster than light travel, or as they call it, warp speed, right? And this, as they kind of say in the movie, is an example of humans' intelligence reaching, which is kind of funny as well. It's like reaching a point that's actually worth like the aliens taking a legitimate notice in and therefore wanting to meet them, because before that they were considered primitive, which I just found that hilarious because it's clearly a comment on current humans. And you know, I think it's fair to say that we are primitive when you look at the world's problems overall, and then you look at like our potential, what we could be doing and what we are doing. It's very difficult to argue with the fact that we are primitive in a lot of different ways. Not to say we're not capable of amazing things and we don't do amazing things every day, because we do. Just saying, we could be exploring the stars right now. What are we doing? And I think that movie really, really just, I know it's a movie, but it really does outline some of the problems we're having. And bringing it back to what we've discussed so far, you mentioned this earlier, and I thought this was interesting. You'd said that there was an influx of sightings right around the time that we, dropped the nuclear bombs. I wonder if maybe that's not a coincidence, and maybe that's aliens taking notice of that. And see, this is twofold, because you can look at this in two different ways. Either one, it's just a weird coincidence, or two, the aliens are taking an active notice in us, and that explains why there's been so many sightings. But then also it begs the question, are these aliens just really sloppy, like being seen like all the time? Or does it not matter that we see them because we can't really comprehend what they are?
I mean, it's interesting because, there's crazy stories about they've seen UFOs come down over military bases that are containing nukes, and they have shut the nukes down, and they've also turned them on. There's been a situation where nuclear weapons have been activated by UFO or UAP, and the people who were at the facility were flipping out. Like, how do we turn? Like, they couldn't even turn it off. They didn't know what to do, and then the UAP shut it down. So it's like it's almost as if they're almost showing us that they have control over all the things that we do, which begs to question, what kind of technology is it really that we're seeing here? Like, what's the potential of that tech? And it has been speculated that they take an interest in war in terms of humans against humans. They seem to be all over the place in war zones. As I said earlier, Arrow released that video of the spherical object over Iraq that was during the war, and they do seem to have an interest in that. And I think about it as if, like us humans, when we view like chimps and ants and all kinds of other animals, one, we don't interfere with them generally. We let them do their thing. We observe from afar. They can see us, obviously. They've already responded to, visual cues of us being there. But just like the UFO and UAP, we don't really get involved. I wonder what they think. Are squirrels thinking when they look at a car? They're like, what is that? It's a UFO. We have to go, you know what I mean? Or an unidentified driving object. We have to go tell the Klan. But it's just interesting, like there's a zoo hypothesis, they call it, to where essentially they're looking at us as we look at other species. They're researching us. And one of the most interesting things you can research as a human is if you're seeing a warring species. You see them go to battle. That's got to be the most interesting thing you can observe. So I would think that they would come and observe that with us.
Hey, you remember earlier when I said, do you believe in aliens? Let's just come back to that for a second. Where do you sit on that?
Oh, man, it's so tough. To me, there's a vast number of things that this could be. David Grush and a lot of these whistleblowers claim NHI, which stands for non-human intelligence. That is a better explanation to me because it doesn't have the connotations of like a gray alien with big eyes that looks like us and sort of walks around like us and flies ships. Non-human can mean anything that's not us. And with the level of technology that we're seeing, to consider it non-human it's very intriguing, because then you have to think about, so then what does non-human mean? What kind of forms can non-human take? And also, how are they able to have the level of technology they have? I mean, the fact that we see them moving at breakneck speeds, turning on a dime, no heat signature. I mean, generally when you have a high-powered object that moves, there has to be a heat signature because it exudes heat to then go in one direction. But it seems that these, according to some people who have been in the back engineering programs, like Bob Lazar is another one. He came out back in like the 80s, and he had claimed to be part of a back engineering program where he was hired to try to recreate what these UAP and UFOs are, according to some of the crashes and crash reports. And he claimed that they were able to these ships were manipulating gravity. And it's interesting also to think that they could be drones. They might not be manned ships. They could be drones of some sort. They could be Chinese or Russian drones too. They could be, American. So I think the people who claim to be in the know about this say a lot of times that most of what we see is actually man-made, but it has been back-engineered from downed craft that we've found. So we may be seeing some things that are from whatever star system or, whatever you want to speculate as to where these non-human intelligences come from. But they say that most of the stuff we see is actually ours.
Yeah, this is interesting to me because I feel like it's foolish to assume we're the only sentient life or only life form. I like this idea that you present of non-human life form not having to be like a physical being, because obviously that opens up, and we've had conversations about this before, like, interdimension, different planes of existence and stuff, which I'm totally there with you on that one. But I kind of find this idea fascinating of us being investigated by the aliens or non-human life forms in the same manner as us looking at ants, because we're fascinated by ants. Fuck me, like the amount of documentaries out there. But then ants are amazing, like the way that they just, I don't know, guys, if you ever get a chance, go check out some ant documentaries. They are amazing, like the way they work and stuff. But point is, if you look at the state of the world right now and how humans are, I imagine if you were studying the human species, there'd be a lot of takeaways you'd have, right? You'd see the compassion, you'd see the love, but you'd also see that we are a species obsessed with war, and we're talking over hundreds, thousands of years, I think that in many ways, a lot of the movies we've seen, particularly in sci-fi, have all often tried to depict worlds, and I'm not counting the dystopian ones or the dodgy ones, because obviously that's a reflection on current day and where we're likely to be headed. But the ones that are a bit more utopian, trying to, I mentioned Star Trek earlier as an example, of like where they're trying to paint this idea of like what we could be. It's like, and that's still very possible, but at the same time, it does kind of ignore some of the more negative aspects of humans. We can be compassionate, we can be sharing, we can be loving, we can also be malevolent, so we can be destructive, we can be selfish, and it's difficult to navigate those traits. We can try to educate each other, we can try to work around those issues, but we can't deny what we are. All we can do is strive to be better. When I look at aliens and non-human life forms, this idea that they want to see us war is kind of horrible. But then I look at like intentions. If let's look at it like this: if you're a higher species and you're observing a lower species, why would you be obsessed with the idea of their war capabilities, with this idea that you plan to one day fight them? Doesn't really make much sense to me, because I mean, obviously they could completely annihilate us right now, and I don't know, maybe unless they're like really sick and they just like this idea of like, oh, we're going to prime our future opponents. Maybe it's that sort of weird, like predator-esque world where they're like scanning us and thinking about like, oh, once it becomes fair game, this is going to be great. It's going to be like sport for us. Or are they literally just showing a genuine interest? Are they just kind of fascinated and wondering what our potential are? Because I think we're at an interesting point in history right now. In 100 years from now, the world is going to look very different, obviously. But I see it as a very clear path. We can either go towards destruction, complete and utter destruction, or we can go towards something more positive where we build as a utopia. I also do look at this idea that maybe to get to the more positive point, perhaps we need to be destroyed first. Maybe that's the only way we learn. Bringing it back to Star Trek, and I know this is like really negative, and people will be like, "What the fuck is he talking about?" In Star Trek: First Contact, they talk about the fact that World War III has happened, and that it's been like 20, 30 years later, and the remaining people are trying to rebuild society. Sort of, they have some warring factions and stuff still, but these few people that are trying to build society, what are they trying to do? They're trying to build faster than light travel. They're trying to do something positive. And then that's the beginning of what then becomes their quote unquote civilized society, that they then build a system where they've eradicated, homelessness and famine and all these different things. They've created a world where humans strive to be better because they now have purpose and are able to pursue things that aren't the destruction of humanity or fighting over the basic resources. Everyone has access to those resources. Therefore, the quest is for growth and for knowledge now, which is a beautiful concept. But again, it came at a cost. It came through the destruction of society. We look at video games, for example, like the Fallout series, which explores this idea that, things go back to basics and humans kind of go into different factions, same as The Walking Dead. I think The Walking Dead is I'll bet it's just a side note, it's got its inconsistencies and issues, which I could go on a whole podcast about that. But the way it sort of portrays humans, I think, is spot on. If we were in a zombie apocalypse, you would definitely have people that would try and work together, and then you'd have people that would just all out try and kill others, get their resources, rob them, whatever, right? And you would always have that because that represents humanity. You've got your good, your bad, and your ugly. That's how it is. I don't think you can ever really like stamp out the ugly, so to speak, because that is a part of us. We are all three, and we are governed by our choices and decision making. That's what ultimately continues to be the driving force, I think, in human evolution is like the choices we make and by the key decision makers and where that leads us. Anyway, we're veering off the path and try to bring us back. Is there anything you want to sort of comment on there before I continue, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, just you say human evolution and, human evolution, technological evolution. If you're a non-human species, say, we'll speculate to say they're from a different galaxy or something, and they have the ability to come here and to view us. And, there is anecdotal evidence, maybe not, I wouldn't consider anecdotal, but there are cave paintings, there are stories in like ancient stories about non-human intelligence aliens being around here even back then. So what's interesting is, say they were viewing us and looking at us ever since ancient times, and now they see that we've been able as a species to harness the power of a star and we put it into a weapon. That to me would be a really, really big reason to come back more often and be like, yo, what are these things doing? What are these monkey things doing with the ability that we've been able to harness the power of a star and put it into a bomb in order to kill other people, in order to take over other lands. And if you look at what it is, what the Earth is, we don't even know what the Earth is. We think we know what the planets are because we have telescopes where we can look at them. But if you think about deeply what it is to be a solar system, why is the solar system doing what it does? What is the sun? What is the purpose of the Goldilocks zone? Like, what's the function of the Earth? And if there is a biological entity that has grown on the Earth that has the ability to literally destroy it, then I would think that's a very interesting thing to keep track of and maybe even intervene with if it gets to a point where, we are actually about to destroy the entire planet.
Okay, a couple of things there. Firstly, do you then think that maybe those aliens are scared we might use said technology to potentially destroy them in the future? Is that kind of what you're somewhat implying with that?
I feel more so that they have a relationship and a care for the cosmos itself.
Mm.
I think that if they wanted to like engage with us in a violent manner, I think in an instant we would be gone. I don't think we have any chance. We could drop every nuke we have on them simultaneously, and I don't think it would do a single thing. I don't think I mean, according to a lot of the fighter pilots and people in the military that have witnessed the advancements that these things have been able to show, would say that we have no chance against them. And I happen to agree. I don't think we have any chance in like a military conflict. But what I do see is it seems like they care. I feel like if I was to say whether or not they are benevolent or malevolent, and I had both of those options, I would lean more toward benevolent for a few reasons. We like to look at them and we anthropomorphize. We kind of project human traits onto higher and lower beings. So it feels to me like when we look at them and we project violent tendencies on them, we are just looking at a reflection of ourselves.
I totally agree with you there. Sorry, go on.
Mhm. And I feel like if you are, say, evolution is, I think it's hard to argue that evolution is not the evolution of consciousness. To me, it seems obvious that evolution is the evolution of consciousness. And if you evolved and you have a higher level of consciousness than us, it seems that with the higher levels of consciousness comes a greater sense of benevolence, a greater sense of unity. I've accessed, as we've talked about before, higher states of consciousness using psychedelics, and other people have using spiritual practices. And whenever you come into contact with something that's at a higher level consciously, it's always based in a foundation of love and unity. And it seems that that's what we're working toward. That's what humans are doing as we're evolving. We seem to be getting less and less warlike, very slowly over time. We're seeing the greatest countries in our world abolishing slavery, treating women right. You know what I mean? It's like we're moving in the trajectory of higher levels of benevolence. So to me, it seems like if the non-human intelligence, call them aliens, whatever you'd like, if they're interested in anything, it's probably preserving the cosmos. So they don't want us to blow each other up, I wouldn't think.
Well, this begs an interesting question because, as I mentioned before, in the Star Trek universe, they had the idea of the non-intervention prime directive, never interfere. Do you think said extraterrestrials, if we got to the point where we were considered destroying ourselves, do you think they'd intervene or not?
I think if we had the potential to destroy the entire planet or to throw off the balance of the solar system, to throw off the balance of any cosmic ecosystem, I think then they would, if they are, out there at all, I think then maybe they would interfere.
Well, that begs a question because theoretically, we already have that power. That's what nuclear warheads are. And if we are to believe what we're told, all of those nuclear warheads are all pointed at each other, and all it takes is a few buttons and boom, end of the world. So we already have that capability, do we not?
Yeah, I mean, maybe again with the evolution of consciousness, maybe they can see farther into time, than us, because time, in our opinion, and the way that we're taught, time is like this linear thing. It takes it's a timeline. It starts here and ends there. But in some wisdom traditions, time is not necessarily just one timeline. It's not eternal. It's more infinite. So it's possible that they have more of an insight as to our trajectory. And when they see that we're on a trajectory that we can't turn ourselves around from, that's maybe when the intervention will happen. I mean, that's kind of hopeful, but who knows?
Makes a fascinating question as well. Because it's like, okay, let's suppose that these life forms can somewhat see into the future, but they can't see specifically which timeline and which future it is. I mean, that goes back into the whole timeline theory, universe theory, quantum immortality theory. I think I've spoken to you about that before. For anyone who is not aware, it's this idea that the end of the universe or end of the world is always occurring, but it happens so frequently and so often that we don't actually know that it's happening, and we just get bumped into new universes all the time. And the only evidence of it happening is things like the Mandela effect. Yeah. Like things where you're so sure that that thing was a certain way and now it's different. And then, you know, when you go to look back into it, conveniently, it's different. But then there's also the argument that, well, memory is fallible and maybe we're just remembering it differently. But I don't know. I think maybe there's something to that. Anyway, moving on. In the timeline of the UFOs, I'm just going to kind of blast through this, and if there's anything that's kind of worth delving into, we'll delve into it. So I want to kind of finish this particular aspect of it off. So there's the Robertson Panel and the Condon Report. An American obsession with the UFO phenomenon was underway. In the hot summer of 1952, a provocative series of radar and visual sightings occurred near National Airport in Washington, D.C. Although these events were attributed to temperature inversions in the air over the city, not everyone was convinced by this explanation. Meanwhile, the number of UFO reports had climbed to a record high. This led the Central Intelligence Agency to prompt the US government to establish an expert panel of scientists to investigate the phenomena. The panel was headed by H.B. Robertson, a physicist at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California, and included other physicists, an astronomer, and a rocket engineer. It's like in the beginning of a joke, isn't it? The Robertson Panel met for 3 days in 1953 and interviewed military officers and the head of Project Blue Book. They also reviewed films and photographs of UFOs. Their conclusions were that 90% of the sightings could easily be attributed to astronomical and meteorological phenomena, e.g. bright, I love that they give a definition of this, e.g. bright planets and stars, meteors, auroras, iron clouds, or to such earthly objects as aircraft, balloons, birds, and searchlights. Number 2, there was no obvious security threat. Number 3, there was no evidence to support the ETH. Parts of the panel's report were kept classified until 1979, and this long period of secrecy helped fuel suspicions of a government cover-up. A second committee was set up in 1966 at the request of the Air Force to review the most interesting material gathered by Project Blue Book. 2 years later, this committee, which made a detailed study of 59 UFO sightings, released its results as Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, also known as the Condon Report, named for Edward U. Condon, the physicist who headed the investigation. The Condon Report was reviewed by a special committee of the National Academy of Sciences. A total of 37 scientists wrote chapters or parts of chapters for the report, which covered investigations of the 59 UFO sightings in detail. Like the Robertson Panel, the committee concluded that there was no evidence of anything other than commonplace phenomena in the reports, and that UFOs did not warrant further investigation. This, together with a decline in sighting activity, led to the dismantling of Project Blue Book in 1969. Before we continue, I find this really interesting because it's like they did all these different studies, all this, heavy investigation, got the world's top people involved, and essentially it was just like, yeah, nothing to worry about, absolutely nothing, all nonsense, move on. Like, really? Nothing at all? It just, I don't know. Maybe it's Captain Cynicism coming out of me again, but just, do you know what I'm saying?
I'm with you.
Very convenient. A massive thank you for watching or listening to this episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. We will be continuing this topic in part 2. In the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Christian PK Reeve. Subscribe to us there, leave us a comment, let us know your thoughts on the show. If you'd like to leave us a review and help support us elsewhere, you can do so on Podchaser or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to the show. Leave us a review. It really, really helps us out. In addition, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/ChristianReeve and get access to exclusive bonus podcast content, as well as other content from all different areas, including the Patreon exclusive show, Life with Christian Reeve. This month, we covered paranormal experiences as part of our spooky season. Thank you very much. Be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.